I've always been involved in the startup world, and I've mentioned earlier, I was running a company called Causr that I'd raised some money from 4 angel investors. I remember just thinking, I want to keep going, and there were various different stages that when I was first diagnosed, I was like, I've got this. I remember speaking to my investors, I've been diagnosed with this, but it's not a problem. 1 in 500 people have got it, and I can just carry on. And then the whole kind of descending of, do I maybe need a transplant? And then from September, being told I might need to have a transplant assessment. And I was like, still then, keep going. And I've spoken about that already. And then in January, being like, okay, actually, the reality is that, again, even more significant, that perhaps I do need this 2-day transplant assessment. And it was really then of January 2018 that I said to my investors that right now I just need to take some time, which again then led into me. I basically rolled things up from a Causr perspective, stopped spending any money on kind of anything just to pull the costs right down, and just had it in a holding mode where there was an app that was functioning, but I wasn't proactively working on it, which was clear from my investors' perspective. And it was then at this stage in the run-up after the summer to think, okay, I need to put a line under this, or I need to make something happen with it. And what are the different options? And I just remember being so committed that I didn't want any stone unturned. So I remember we had some potential clients, and I remember thinking, for example, they were going to buy a license to Causr. So maybe it's a big consultancy firm that they could then use the technology for their own employees. So if their employees are traveling, imagine people are going to New York and people from New York coming to London, but often they don't know that each other are traveling at the same time. And they come back to their home office and they're like, oh, I was in New York last week. Oh, so was I. Oh, we should have connected or met up or whatever. And there's business value. And there's various business opportunities that companies really, they did see it. And they said they've been talking about this type of thing internally. And this could be a really great fit. So one specific company, I offered a £50,000 a year license deal for 3 years to build this out and to rebrand it for them. They were super interested, which was great. And I remember getting quite far down the line of the proposal, but they sent me a compliance document. Ultimately, I just wasn't compliant for anything. I could barely answer 10% of the questions, and you looked at it and you're like, I'm never gonna get this. And I just remember following up, but then also being very transparent with them at the time, being like, look, the reality is I've got this condition, but there's a value, we've built something that works. You could potentially even, instead of needing to do an acquisition for a startup, which maybe would be prohibitive, maybe you could just buy the license, but it could be an exclusive license, which means that you're the only company that has access to it, which is maybe an opportunity. And I remember the interest, but again, it's not their core business, and that didn't land. I then remember calling one of my competitors at the time that had raised about $14 million and were doing, it was swiping, a different kind of mechanism, but to connect people, networking. And I remember just arranging to connect with the founder, and I knew he knew about me already and the company because they'd been downloading it and I could see the details and whatever. So I knew I was on their radar, and I just messaged them and I just said, look, can we have a talk? I'm at this crossroads, it would be really great. It was a shame because right at the beginning of the call, the founder just said, look, I'm not interested, and whatever you're going to say, I'm not interested. And I thought it was so frustrating and closed-minded, but that was it. And I still said to him, look, I still want to share with you just so that at least I've said everything, I've done everything, and I know that if we put down the phone today, it's just very clear for you, my position. And I suggested, look, do you acquire of us, even if it's a very small amount of money, nominal £1, whatever, but with a view that I'll then work for you for a year. You get the PR that you've acquired a UK startup, you've got some other investors on board. There was a logic in my head. I don't think I was just drinking the Kool-Aid and pretending everything was fine, but there was a logic that I thought this would make sense. And I thought I could deliver really great. Every time I've spoken on stage about Causr, I've won awards and prizes, and people say it's a great idea, and I knew at the time I had something that I could provide value for that company. But like he said at the beginning of the call, he's not interested, and it was just like, that was that. And I remember I wrote a long article, again I'll put the links in the comment, about often we talk in startup world about success, and I've raised money and I've done this, but then we don't talk about on the other side that the reality is 9 in 10 businesses fail, and the challenges for CEOs and founders, especially sole founders, it's really challenging, and from a mental health perspective. And I feel like that's also like partly from a story to tell around why it's just very difficult and why there isn't like more support for founders. And I sometimes joke going, I would never want to wish on anyone what I did at Student Beans, let alone at Causr. Very different journeys, but it's brutal, and the resilience that you need. And I know we're going to talk later in another video just about, funnily enough, the startup world has really helped, I think, me process and deal with my heart condition, because the things that I had to go through and the challenges and the vulnerability and trying to make something from nothing is an amazingly challenging journey that I think can build and does resilience, and very transferable for any area in life. But it was at that time I feel like I had turned over every stone, and I remember making the very difficult decision that I wanted to close it down. I remember saying also at the end of the article I wrote, it's like my heart just wasn't in it. I just couldn't be passionate about it anymore. I really tried, and we had about 3,000 users. Richard Branson had talked about us, about technology being an enabler to help more connection face to face, and I believed in it. And at the same time, also on reflection, a good idea might not be a good business. And there's lots to talk about. In the US, had I raised £150,000, you would have raised 10 million there, or whatever it is, and there'd be different people, different team, different time. Was I too early or too late? There's so many things I went through, but fundamentally I got to that point of, I think, from a health perspective as well, with my uncertainty. I don't want to wrap it up to say I closed it down because of my heart condition. There were fundamental challenges in the business. It wasn't working the way that I wanted it to. It should have been working. I wasn't a technical founder, and I was working with an agency who I think did everything they could do within the resources that we had. But it felt like time, and I remember being very pained. Also from a responsibility, speaking to investors, being like, look, it's not worked. And there are things called SEIS and EIS investments where they get a lot of that money back, but I don't know anyone's individual situation. And it still today feels like this. It's not pressure. Look, investors, they're grown up, they make their own decisions, and fine. But I'm the type of person, I do feel like I had a responsibility, and plays on my mind. And I remember saying to each of them individually that this is where I'm at, and this, I think it's best. If I close it now, I can give you back. It was a few £1,000s each. It wasn't a significant amount of money relatively, but it felt like the right thing to do, and I could have drained it fully and carried on. But it felt like also this timing of having the ICD installed felt like the right time to go into that operation with clarity of, okay, it's done. And I remember speaking to my accountant, being like, I want this wrapped up by then. In a good way, that felt very complete. That was really important for me. And here you ask the question, what were you doing now? That was like the backstory to then what was to come. But interestingly, I mentioned already, I did my dissertation on coaching, the impact of coaching in organisations. And I've always been asked in the last 20 years or so for various advice and guidance and support from other, mainly entrepreneurs and founders, but also people just generally in business and life. I was approached, funnily enough, by a guy called David, who's now been my client for over 3 years. I was approached by David. Interestingly, he'd seen me speak at University of Birmingham. He was a University of Birmingham graduate. He said he just wanted some kind of advice. He was running a company. So I thought, sure, fine. I've got the time. And this was about a couple of weeks before the ICD operation. We met up in a local coffee shop in Kentish Town. He shared, and at the end of the session, it's interesting. I walked down the street thinking everyone knows what's inside my head. Maybe a bit scary if everyone did know what was inside my head. But from a startup perspective and experience and what I've done and what I've gained and learned, and from doing Student Beans from scratch to building it to when I left, there were 50 people. There are now over 200 people there. And from a Causr perspective, having built something and not succeeded as well, I guess I've got both sides of the coin. That many coaches and mentors, they've not set one up, necessarily one, let alone two, and one that hasn't succeeded and one that continues to go from success to success. So I guess I've got this unique proposition and experience that I can add a huge amount of value. And every time I deliver on stage, or I speak at events, or I'm mentoring or coaching, there's a huge amount that I know whoever I'm working with kind of gets from that. I remember being in Westfield, the shopping centre, and they had this pay-as-you-feel massage. And it just struck me that coaching, for many people perhaps, is inaccessible, because if they've not had it before, they don't necessarily value it. And at the same time, the value and importance of when you pay for something, that you value it more, as opposed to if you give it for free. And I've seen time and time again when I have mentored or given my time, which I have and I still do, but still there seems like this gap that when you're doing that, the value often is not reciprocated, it's not received in the same way that if someone was actually paying for it, there's more attention, then they value what you're contributing far more. So it then got me thinking, if I do this pay as you value approach, then I'm accessible and I'm not explicitly doing it for the money, but it will be nice also from a value exchange that I'm also contributing and knowing that I'm making a difference to people and that I'm getting rewarded for that as well. So I went back to David and I said, look, I'm doing this going forward, and we had a session, but if you're interested, and I think especially from a sole founder perspective, there's a huge amount of value. It's isolating, it can be very lonely, challenging, and you're navigating everything by yourself and actually just like a sounding board. And so I didn't have this at the time, but the work definitely evolved and I saw some themes that came up. And one of the themes was just about creating space. So when you're so in the moment and connected with it, you don't have the space and perspective. And actually by then taking some time out and working with someone else, that gives you that space. And the second one is accountability. So about saying to someone, I'm going to do this by then, and having that structure around it. And thirdly is about support. So I coined it SAS. It's like these 3 pillars of the coaching work that I was doing, wanted to do. So David agreed to be my first client. It's a really interesting way of working. And a friend said, but what happens if someone pays you lower and you're not happy with how much they pay? And I said, it's really about that value, and you can see if they're getting value and they're delivering on it and they're proactive around it, then actually that works for me. And I remember there was a recent grad that was ended up paying £40 for a session. I was not blown away by it, fine. For a number of months, they were like, I want to launch a podcast. They did it and they were in action, and it was so satisfying to see on his journey. But on one of the final sessions, it ended up being one of the final sessions, he was in a noisy place, he wasn't engaged, and I just said to him, look, if this session cost you £500, would you be approaching it in a different way? Would you be somewhere quiet? Would you have delivered on the things that you said you were going to do, etc.? It's not always about delivering. There might be things in the way of you delivering, which is where the coaching comes in, so that we can explore that. But at the same time, they acknowledged as well, you're absolutely right. And so we stopped the sessions. But a few months later, he came back to me and said, look, all the work we did, it culminated in me getting this dream new job that I've got, and thank you for the journey that we went on and what we did, which is so satisfying. It was a really interesting life change of going right from my 12 to 18 hour days, startup world, to going, you know what, I want to contribute to people. And also from like creating a vision for myself, it was I want 1 client a day, so that I get up, I've contributed and I've made a difference to someone. So every night going to bed knowing that I've made a difference. And the uncertainty of my heart condition and not knowing where I'm going to be in 3 or 6 months' time at the time, it felt very empowering for me to have that structure. And I said I wanted to make I had this target of this amount per month, which would on average be this much per session. It was a real dream, because within 3 months of making that decision, that's where I ended up with my coaching aspirations. It's such a privilege to work with my clients. Again, I'll talk about it a bit later on, but it's so rewarding to be able to define, and a lot in the work that I do with my clients is to create the lives that they love and dream of, to demonstrate that as well myself, to show them this is what I'm doing. And I know I get that feedback loop. It helps them. They can see that I've made decisions that perhaps are against the grain and not the norm, but that are really fulfilling and really makes a difference for me and ultimately for them as well. Thanks for watching. Feel free to check out the British Heart Foundation, Cardiomyopathy UK and Save 9 Lives for more information. Why not comment on the video, tell me what you think or ask a question, and subscribe to the channel to continue to follow my journey.